Hello, good evening. My name is Sabel, I'm the curator at Gasworks, and tonight we are delighted to present Jamie Lorimer. He's an environmental geographer at the University of Oxford who has been studying the politics and the histories of wildlife conservation. In 2015, he published Wildlife in the Anthropocene, which is a book that deals with the present and future of conservation. And right now he's about to publish a new book that we are very excited about, dealing with microorganisms and how they are becoming more and more crucial in contemporary biopolitics and the management of life. And as you probably know, this is part of Lauren Gault's public program of the exhibition Citra that you can see in the gallery. After the talk, we'll leave the gallery open for about 15 minutes in case you want to visit. And then we opened about 3 weeks ago, so the exhibition will remain open until late March. And just to say very quickly a few words about how the talk relates to the exhibition. Basically, the reason that Lauren and us got in touch with Jamie over the research towards the show is that Lauren Gault, who was a resident at Gasworks a few months ago and just produced her first solo exhibition here in London, has been increasingly interested in the boundaries and the relationships between wildness and domestication. She's an artist that has strong ties to rural environments. She was raised in rural Northern Ireland. And throughout the development of the exhibition, she got particularly interested in our relationship to plants and animals. In particular, you'll see when you enter the gallery, there is a large-scale fabric installation which actually references this image of Mithra, an ancient god who is very often depicted as a human male figure, which is cutting a bull's throat and feeding its blood to a dog. And this image resonated in Lauren's practice and has been kind of permeating the exhibition. This idea of a human taming an animal figure, but also feeding a domesticated animal who is humanly socialized. And there are several, it's a very kind of layered exhibition. You'll see she is an artist that engages very deeply with the materials themselves. But there's many references to animal materials, such as horn. Some of the light interventions that you'll see in the gallery have been done by basically intervening the gallery lighting with polished horn, so it's horn light. Or, for example, hoof prints of an auroch, which is an ancient cow, a pre-domesticated cow, which populated Europe and other regions of the world kind of many years ago, and which have been part of Jamie's research, who has been actually kind of retracing the political histories of how, in different moments and times, people has wanted to backbreed those animals. And what does this backbreeding imply? This idea of going back to native species, going back to ancient animals. So what we are trying to do with the public program is basically exploring all these small bodies of knowledge that are referenced and layered in Lauren's production. And she was very interested in bringing in Jamie, whose research we think is kind of groundbreaking, and presenting it as part of her project as well. So we are delighted to present Jamie today, and thanks for coming.
Great, thank you. So, thank you, Joe. If I stand here, can you see roughly what's going on? So, as Sabel says, I'm an environmental geographer at Oxford, and much of my research has been interested in popular understandings of nature and how they come to shape environmental management at different scales, both from the kind of planetary scale of the Anthropocene down to this interest in microbes. And so they hooked me up with Lauren, and we've had a series of conversations, I guess, to try and establish what our mutual interests might be. I'm not sure if you've seen the exhibition, and we sort of settled on 3 themes that I want to organise my talk around this evening, which are partly about my own work, but also partly about some of the themes that I think are opened up by the exhibition next door. So one of the themes that comes out of both an interest in the Anthropocene, but also what Lauren's doing is I guess about the status of time travel and science fiction in contemporary discussions about the present. There's a sense that the time is out of joint, that we are moving out of one epoch into another epoch, but the evidence required to make that claim is quite speculative. It's quite uncertain. There's a sort of a new form of science coming into existence which is trying to imagine these deep futures by making reference to deep past. And so I want to say a bit about that. And then some of the more substantive focus of the exhibition is about, I guess, the question of wildness in a planet that is shaped by human activities. So on the one hand, there's a concern that we're bringing the wild to an end because of the reach of human activities. But to a certain extent, that only works if wildness is indexed to the absence of humans. Clearly, there's lots of animal life on Earth, there's lots of geological processes ongoing, and in some ways, the story of the Anthropocene is about a kind of coming catastrophe. It's a sense that the Earth has the ability to push back and be wild. If you think of the stories around the virus at the moment, there's a sense that some forms of wildness are quite live and well and threaten our security. So there's a sense that wildness is perhaps not as easily understood on a kind of wild domestic axis, if you like. So I want to say a bit about wildness, and particularly around this idea of rewilding, which has become a kind of popular approach to conservation in the UK and elsewhere, and then to focus even more specifically on cows, and on the aurochs, which is one of the species that has become celebrated as a potential tool for rewilding. So the aurochs is the animal from which all contemporary cattle are domesticated. It's extinct, but the belief is that we could backbreed or recreate the aurochs by recombining the genetic material held within contemporary cattle to come up with a wild grazing tool that could do rewilding in different places. So I say a bit about that. And I guess Lauren and I share an interest, if you like, in the ways in which particular folk knowledges about the wild and particular folk knowledges about when the wild was come to shape contemporary practices. I'm going to say a bit about a parallel backbreeding project that began in a kind of dark part of the 20th century, in which National Socialists got very involved in the idea of taking us back to some organic relationship with nature in which wild cows were part of that. So if you like, three themes that will run through the talk. Some of these are slides that I use for kind of undergraduate teaching, so apologies if they seem quite pedestrian in that way, and then hopefully we'll have time at the end for discussion. Okay, so a little bit about the Anthropocene. I'm kind of assuming that term is fairly familiar in this space, yeah? Anyone heard of the Anthropocene? Okay, so the Anthropocene is this claim by geologists and by Earth system scientists that the Earth has entered a new epoch by virtue of the magnitude of human effects upon the planetary system. So Paul Crutzen, who is an atmospheric chemist, won a Nobel Prize for identifying the hole in the ozone layer, wrote this piece in 2000 in which he said we should stop talking about the Holocene, which, if you like, is the epoch that geologists still think we're in, which began 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age, and said humans are such a significant actor in the planetary system, we should talk about the Anthropocene. And he coined this new word, the Anthropocene, at that point in time. And it travelled. It travelled fast. It travelled both within the sciences, but has also escaped out of the sciences to start to shape, if you like, popular discussions in environmentalism about our relationship to the planet in the present. So Will Steffen, who is another climate scientist from Australia, talks about how the human imprint on the global environment has now become so large and active that it rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the human system. So they want to present this idea, if you like, of the human technosphere, so all the human infrastructure that could be considered alongside the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and other sort of spheres, if you like, that we need to factor in humans as this driving force of planetary change. And the proposal being for geologists that we might, if you like, add a new slice to the top of this diagram here, in which we have a new epoch that begins in this vanishingly small fragment at the top here, this kind of top slice of soil at the top here. So we're currently in the Holocene, which began nearly 12,000 years ago. But for geologists, the proposal is that we need to, if you like, divide up that time series one step further to diagnose this new epoch, which is driven by human activities. There's been lots of work done to try and work out what it is that is propelling us towards this new epoch. Earth system scientists talk about this idea of a great acceleration, a series of parallel trends or kind of hockey stick type graphs that track a collection of socioeconomic trends on the left, increases in population, increases in GDP, increases in energy use, with a whole set of environmental impacts on the right. These are the kind of stories that will circulate in concerns about planetary impacts, all showing a comparable trend. And the idea is that at some point along here, a tipping point is crossed, a threshold is crossed that will tip us from one planetary state into another planetary state. The term that's used here is this idea that the planet has boundaries. To a certain extent, there are kind of calculable limits in these different areas: ocean acidification, climate change. I mean, the detail doesn't matter so much here, but the idea is that there is this idea of the planet as a system that is verged on the point of tipping from one state to another state. So we're reaching this idea that time is out of joint. There is a kind of anxiety in the scientific community about the state of the planet. There is this story that we might be approaching various tipping points or cascades. So the idea of Earth system science is that all these things are connected together, and there are positive feedback loops in which a tip in one area, for example, the switching off of the Gulf Stream, might result from the melting of ice sheets. So you've got this planetary imagination of systems that are linked together that will tip from one state to another, and a growing sense that they are connected together, and we're approaching some kind of juncture in which the Anthropocene begins. So this is a very catastrophic imaginary, an imaginary in which the Earth moves from the Holocene, the conditions that have, if you like, nurtured human civilization, towards this coming epoch. Again, just another visualization that gives us this sense of an Earth system that is at a key moment, that is marked by potential tipping points. This comes from Will Steffen. If you imagine the ball is rolling down the valley, and the valley is a time series, we're going from the top to the bottom, we've already, if you like, tipped into this trough that is leading us down towards a hothouse Earth scenario. We're at a juncture here, in the context of the COP negotiations, for example, in which we could tip back over this ridge to arrive at a stabilized Earth if we keep carbon dioxide within a certain threshold. But if we fail to do that, we'll move over this threshold and tip down into this hothouse Earth state, this state in which the planet has fundamentally moved into this Anthropocene condition. This plays out that idea of time in a slightly different way. So this is the kind of long-term cycles that the planet has gone in, where it moves between ice ages and interglacial periods. When there would have been at some points a good mile of ice above our heads here. At the moment we're moving out of this historic loop here. The argument is we could bring ourselves back with significant political intervention, but if we don't, we're heading way out here to the hothouse Earth scenario, where it gets that much harder to move back in again. Okay. Slightly depressing thoughts for a Tuesday night in February. But this is, I guess, the kind of story that emerges from climate science at the moment as a kind of planet poised in a state of crisis, a kind of series of tipping points that we need to be concerned about. So that's the Earth system science story, if you like. But ultimately, the decision as to whether or not we're in the Anthropocene comes down to geologists. So geologists are this quite conservative profession. They like to look at rocks, and they like to look at rocks from a long, long time ago in order to work out when lines can be drawn in the time series. And ideally for geologists, you find very clear evidence in the rocks and you drive a golden spike into the rock, and this marks the boundary between different eras. Okay. Now, stuff that gets laid down in rocks takes an awfully long time. It takes a good million years for a fossil to be formed. But geologists at the moment are being asked to look for evidence of a new epoch that is yet to be fossilized, if you like. So whatever it is that comes to mark the Anthropocene won't come into existence for a good million years because it doesn't get fossilized. Okay, so there's a sort of, geologists are being asked to speculate into a future that they don't yet know about, and to work out what would be the correct marker that would allow them hypothetically to drive a golden spike in somewhere to something that's not yet fossilized, if that makes sense. So there's this kind of very speculative form of science that's been called upon for geologists to make this decision on the basis of something that's yet to happen. And so there's been lots of discussions about what that might be. What is it that in a million years' time will be the fossilized marker, the human, if you like, strata that gets laid down? Everything from chicken bones, which are found all over the world in industrial quantities, car tires, concentrations of carbon dioxide, which show up in ice cores, or show up in lake sediments, or show up in tree rings. What they've settled on is evidence of nuclear testing during the Second World War, if you like. So the first nuclear bombs that were set off threw up these radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. They were scattered around and they come down fairly consistently around the world, and you can time date them very, very accurately because we knew when that bomb went off. So for geologists, it's perfect. We know it down to the millisecond almost, and we can drive the golden spike in somewhere to make that claim. But it's quite interesting to think about what else might you look for if you were a future geologist returning to Earth. One imagines a kind of future extraterrestrial geologist in a million years' time sent back on some mission from space to work out what happened on this planet, if you like, to read off from the strata what happened to human civilization, what would it be that one would look for? Would you look for nuclear radiation? Would you look for chicken bones, or would you look for something else? This is the thought experiment that geologists are being asked to do in order to think about what will it be that marks the Anthropocene in the future. Okay. It's worth pausing maybe just to think about what it is that you might look for. I mean, one of the interesting things, if you imagine this extraterrestrial geologist on a beach here looking like a human, but they could be in any form, they've travelled from far away to the Earth through these sedimented layers of radio waves that we've sent out through time. So if you like, there's a geology of radio signals that are heading out into space that you pass through as you come into the planet that you could start to read off as a kind of historical marker of human civilization, let's say, as a sort of archaeology of space telecommunications that's out there. So anyway, so there's a series of discussions underway in geology in which they're being asked to make this cut, to make this distinction, to work out when the Anthropocene begins. But more generally, my colleagues in Earth System Sciences, on the one hand, they're enjoying this moment in the sun, so to speak. They've become very, much funded. There's much excitement about Earth System Science, but there's also this deep anxiety. This is not the kind of detection that you want to have to tell the public about. So there's a broad sense that the Anthropocene captures this idea of time being out of joint, of things falling apart. So Earth systems are changing at an unprecedented speed. There is this concern about a rupture in the Earth system, this move from one phase to another phase. These new speculative knowledge practices come into existence in geology, in which geologists are having to reach into the future to try and think to the present. And if you like, the Anthropocene has come to capture a broader anxiety, a broader zeitgeist, which I assume is why there's so many people in the room tonight, about the state of the world, if you like. It's a kind of term, particularly in the art world, that's come to kind of capture a particular set of concerns about human-environment relationships. Okay, so that's the first theme, if you like, that we might think with the exhibition, is a certain idea of time travel. If one of the provocations for Lauren's work was this discovery of this archival piece of science fiction written by one of her relatives, which does a kind of H.G. Wells travel into the future to think through relationships in the future in the context of the past. Okay. Now, much of my work has been interested in a more specific subset of relationships associated with the Anthropocene, which is how we manage life, how conservationists come to think about what we should save in these discussions about a planet that's going through phase shifts, if you like. And if you like, one of the things that the Anthropocene really calls into question is a kind of popular American, European idea that nature is nature if it's kept fast, secure, and untouched by human hands. So the kind of nature that until very recently David Attenborough would give us in the BBC sort of Earth series, in which nature, or at least nature in Africa, is marked by the absence of humans both in the present and in the past. They have a whole team of people in Bristol post-production airbrushing out the Land Rovers and the hot air balloons and all the infrastructure required to make these, big blockbuster Netflix films. There's this kind of, we hold on to this cherished idea of nature as being something, that's only natural if people aren't there, but it's very hard to find, it's quite hard to substantiate, and many people now think it's deeply unsustainable to have that as your model of what nature is. We're slightly more permissive in the UK in terms of what we think nature is, but nature really begins in a kind of, or it stops at the Downton Abbey era with the rise of industrial modern farming and the end of the feudal agricultural system. So the Natural Trust, if you like, has a version of nature which is largely about kind of pastoral, rural, idyllic scenes, hedgerows and oak trees and happy peasants and sheep and all the rest of it, or upland areas which have no sheep, lots of sheep and no trees, and the same kind of, if you like, baseline which is still indexed to the absence of modern life. So conservation, for better or worse, has risen to prominence with a particular idea of nature that is unmarked by modern human hands. Elsewhere, we've got slightly better at acknowledging the presence of localized human impacts. So a lot of the campaigning, for example, about deforestation, this is a WWF campaign against tropical deforestation, will acknowledge the impacts of modern human activity. But really what the Anthropocene does is to bring to an end that idea of nature that can be saved just by drawing lines on the map and protecting protected areas. You know. So this is a kind of imagined North America, these are the national parks. For a long time that was what conservation was about. It was about preserving fixed territories, keep them untouched by humans, stop them changing, job done. Okay. Now clearly we accept the premise of the Anthropocene, as Bill McKibben has it, that version of nature comes to an end. There's nowhere on Earth unmarked by human activities, and therefore, if you like, that model of conservation becomes antiquated. Instead, we need to think about what ecologists term novel ecosystems, so new ecosystems that are shaped by climate change. This is a kind of heat map of projected future temperatures. Novel ecosystems shaped by accelerated human land use. This is Dubai from the air, in which humans are driving the kind of the use of resources, and novel ecosystems shaped by the globalization of life, if you like, not just human life, but the globalization of species along transportation systems that have radically reconfigured where life goes and where life is. We'll all be familiar in London of pigeons and rats and parakeets and all the rest of it. There are these animals that are flourishing in these new networks of globalization, but there are clearly some that don't travel well or don't live well with the travelers, if you like, that are kind of creating these new biogeographies that are challenged by globalization. So for some, this is a disaster, and it's fair to say that this is not good news for biodiversity. But there are others who, if you like, have a slightly more hopeful take on how we might make sense of these new worlds that are coming into existence. So this is a very elaborate diagram produced by Earl Ellis, who's a geographer in the US, who tries to move away from that kind of red-green binary that I showed you before to think about a range of land uses arrayed along this spectrum here. So he talks about living on a used planet, but it's a used planet that still has ecological value. It's still a planet that life lives in, and it's a planet that we want to think seriously about conserving. So there's a kind of typology along the bottom of types of use, from the urban through to the wild, treeless and barren, and he's interested in looking at the different drivers of what shapes the land use in these places. Okay. So there's a more, if you like, sophisticated model of what life is on Earth that you can start to colour in, and they produce these maps where there's red stuff and there's purple stuff and there's blue stuff, and you get a different way of thinking about what nature is. And this work has produced a lot of debate in the conservation community. On the one hand, there's people who are somewhat celebratory about this end of nature. Emma Maris, who's a popular science writer, has this nice metaphor of the Earth as a rambunctious garden. So rambunctious is kind of lively and dynamic. This is the High Line in New York, pre-restoration, which has become something of a kind of go-to site for people who celebrate urban brownfield renewal. Chris Thomas is an ecologist in York who wants to, if you like, celebrate these species that have come to flourish in these new urban globalized networks of transport. And one dimension of this that I guess has become to prominence in the UK is this enthusiasm for rewilding. Okay, so Monbiot and Isabella Tree might not agree with these folk. I'm doing a bit of a sort of violence in terms of where they're coming at it from. But there is a sense in the UK at the moment that the Anthropocene, this kind of concern about the magnitude of environmental change, might not need conservation to give up on the core project of trying to create flourishing, living landscapes. People come across these books. So Monbiot is a commentator, writes for The Guardian, had a kind of midlife crisis, moved to Wales, discovered a particular approach to conservation, which is called rewilding, and he writes this kind of, it's partly a travelogue, it's partly a manifesto for how we might bring back animals to the British countryside, but very much on the left, very critical of the kind of concentrated land ownership in the UK. Isabella Tree is married to Charlie Burrell, and they have a very large estate in Sussex. Charlie is a baron. He's part of the British aristocracy, and they run a dairy farm which they took out of production and have turned into a rewilding project in Sussex. So they come at this from very different angles. This is the kind of Telegraph model of rewilding, if you like. This is the Guardian model of rewilding. But they actually get on very well, believe it or not. And George founded this organisation, Rewilding Britain, which Charlie's now the chairman of. And on the surface, they look, quite polarised. But actually, behind the scenes, there's this kind of political synchrony going on to try and promote this version of rewilding as a new way of doing landscape conservation in the UK. Okay, so in terms of what rewilding is, in some ways rewilding we could see as quite a radical break from conservation in the UK, which was very preoccupied with rare species. Okay, we got very concerned in the 20th century with extinctions, and very concerned, if you like, with counting and documenting extinctions, and if you like, tracing things shuffling off and dying, and particularly around the preservation of landscapes, low intensity agricultural landscapes that created the spaces for these rare species. And rewilding says, fine, but actually what you need is much bigger landscapes which are driven by ecological processes, rather than micromanaging these sites in order to save this butterfly or this insect or this bird. Okay, so there's a much greater focus here, if you like, on thinking about long-term historical dynamics. So Monbiot has this nice idea in his book that we live in landscapes that are haunted by absent animals. So wherever we go, we walk in the shadows of the past. And he looks at hedgerows, which I'd never really noticed before. You're familiar with hedgerows, these sort of mundane things in the British countryside, which were used before fences to enclose land and to keep livestock here. And he says the only reason that these species can survive the violence that we do to them to make hedges is that they evolved with elephants. So they evolved being continually smashed down by large herbivores, and they grew up and they got smashed down and grew up. And this, if you like, hawthorn and species like that, is evidence that the UK used to have very large herbivores in it. It used to have hippos, used to have elephants, and the vegetation of the UK is in some ways haunted by the absence of these big animals. And if you brought back these big animals, you'd have a much more functional, much more dynamic landscape than we do at present. So yeah, as you're walking around Hyde Park, have a look at the hedges and think about what it would mean to have an elephant smashing them down. We get other visualizations. So this is an artist, Jerome Helmer, who did this really, for me, compelling visualization for an organization called Rewilding Europe. And Rewilding Europe is an organization trying to bring back particular animals, trying to trace a very long-term history of land management in Europe. Okay, so it kind of mixes a story of the, if you like, the kind of cornucopia, a kind of figure of bounty, with this sort of DNA helix unraveling. And if you think of it as a kind of morality tale, you know, the past is all right. We have this sort of paleo imaginary of men with deer, or people with deer hunting deer, and then the rise of agriculture and the intensification of agriculture sees this unraveling of human-environment relationships. And at this point, the rewilders kick in and they sort of recouple wildlife and humans so that we can have urban life alongside big dead cows, lynxes, and sort of predators in the landscape. Okay, so there's this very long-term time series sketched out in these kind of diagrams in which you might think back to the bears and the elephants that smash the hedgerows, work your way through the kind of dystopic unraveling of land use, and see it woven together at the end in some kind of future in which wildness and agriculture are brought together. There's a slightly different North American version of this. So there was a paper published by Josh Donlan in 2006 in which he suggested that although there are many extinct animals in North America, we could find surrogates from them in other parts of the world. Okay, so there used to be elephants in North America, there aren't any more. Why don't we get some elephants from Africa, bring them to North America, and they can do the things that elephants used to do in these parts of North America. There used to be something a bit like a cheetah that would chase the pronghorn antelope. Pronghorn antelopes jump crazy distances in the air. There's nothing chasing them. Clearly you need something to chase them. Let's bring a cheetah from Africa to North America. All sorts of political sensitivities about that, you can imagine. But the kind of ecological case is being made that if you look much further back in time, you can imagine much more exciting futures, and particularly futures that might adapt to whatever's coming with climate change and the Anthropocene. There's a sense you can use these kind of science fiction portals to go back to think about the future and what kind of lives might be entangled into the future. Okay. And in the world of rewilding, there are particular species that are given much more importance than others. So, we're not too concerned about pandas. We're not too concerned about, cuddly species that are, nice but don't do much ecologically. There's this interest in what are called keystone species. So these are species a bit like the keystone or bridge, you can imagine, that they have such a fundamental role within their ecology that if you take them out, the bridge falls down. And the idea being that you could rebuild the bridge and put the keystone in, and you'd have a much more functional ecosystem, which in some ways could be left to those animals to drive it and run it. So the famous example being the wolves at Yellowstone. So the wolf was returned to Yellowstone because it was a charismatic, cuddly species. Nobody really knew what wolves did. But it turns out that by virtue of their hunting, wolves have these cascading effects upon a much wider set of animals within Yellowstone. So the wolves chased the elk differently. They ate some of them, but actually it wasn't so much the eating of them that mattered. It was that the elk started grazing differently because the wolves created what's called an ecology of fear. And as a consequence, the vegetation grew differently and the whole landscape was radically transformed by the presence of a relatively small number of wolves in this system. So conservationists in Scotland look at this and say, great, let's bring back the wolf, and it will lead to the reforestation of Scotland in that way. So there's a sense that some species have much greater ability within an ecosystem to deliver particular desired landscapes. In the UK, we're very enamoured of the beaver at the moment. You may well have picked up on Michael Gove, for example, is very enthusiastic about beavers for some reason. He's kind of been taken by beavers. And there are all sorts of experiments underway to try and reintroduce beavers into the UK. So beavers used to be part of the British wildlife. They went extinct in the 16th century. And what beavers do is build dams, obviously. And in building dams, they fundamentally change how water passes through the landscape. And what they tend to do is to slow the passage of water through the landscape, which makes them very useful for flood prevention. And also very cheap for flood prevention, because you put the beaver in, builds these dams, and you don't have to pay all these people you would otherwise be paying to do, with small diggers up in upland areas taking out drains. So the idea is that you fence the beavers into a desired bit of the river, you stick them in, you put them to work, they take out all the drainage, and it slows the flow, stops the flooding, cleans up the water, etc., etc. So beavers are put to work as water engineers in this model. So there's some in Devon, there's some down in Sussex, there's the sort of feral beavers in Scotland that were introduced and are sort of running rampant on the Tay, and so the beavers is one of these species that have been kind of much heralded as tools for rewilding. Perhaps the most bizarre experiment that's yet to start, but is building quite a lot of support, is a proposal by these two Russian scientists, Nikita and Sergei Zimov, who inherited this big research station in Siberia at the end of the collapse of the Cold War. So they were running a research station, and they had this big tract of Siberia, big tract of land that they've been studying, and they're very concerned about the melting of the permafrost. The permafrost is due to melt with climate change, and if the permafrost melts, it releases a lot of methane, and the methane accelerates global warming, and it's one of these, if you like, positive feedback loops that we talked about at the start. So what they suggest is that to prevent the melting of the permafrost, you need lots of big animals that trample the snow, and the trampling of the snow creates this insulating blanket that stops the permafrost melting. And the best thing for that would be the mammoth. So the mammoth used to, if you like, be the keystone species that grazed the tundra. They have a very old Russian tank that they drive around to simulate the effect of the mammoth, and they reckon that they can, if they could bring back some mammoth, this would, if you like, do the job. It's a very good marketing tool, as you can imagine, and it coincides with this interest that's growing around this idea of de-extinction, the sort of Jurassic Park style. Let's bring back species now we have these sophisticated genetic tools. It's the kind of thing you could imagine a sort of Richard Branson type, version of rewilding would take place through some philanthropist pouring a load of money into it. Okay. But the idea here is that, in a way, the mammoth have such ability that they can, if you like, change the dynamics of the global carbon system. Okay. So a relatively small number of mammoth would prevent the melting of the permafrost, would prevent the release of the methane, so the mammoth becomes this tool for global warming. Okay. So there's a kind of planetary scale imagination in which these keystone species are shaping circulations of energy within the Earth system. Okay. So that the second theme then, I guess, is about this ambivalent status of the wild and the domestic in this kind of Earth system that we now understand to be shaped by people. So there's a sense that you could introduce wild animals that have this leverage to, if you like, change the system, but they're very much changing the system to make it more compatible with human life. Okay, so is this a kind of domestication of the planet that we're doing with mammoths as our kind of tools for the job? Or are we releasing mammoths as some kind of rewilding experiment in which the mammoths get to run the show? Yeah, that kind of binary is quite hard to think through when there isn't a kind of pure place and untouched life to kind of let go. Okay. The final thing I want to pick up on is Lauren's interest in aurochs. So I've been interested in aurochs for some time, and particularly interested in the way in which contemporary versions of the aurochs have been celebrated as tools for rewilding. Okay, so because aurochs are the antecedents of all our cattle, we know quite a lot about them, and we know that humans have had very close relationships with aurochs for many thousands of years. So this is one of the Lascaux cave paintings. So more than 17,000 years ago, we've got this close human relationship, this veneration, this interest in cattle that goes back a long way. Aurochs would have been common across much of Western Europe, into Asia, and right across to parts of Russia and northern China up here. So they were, if you like, a key component of the ecology in Europe at the end of the last ice age. And they would have been particularly important alongside a wider array of grazing and browsing animals. So if you like, for conservationists, this is these are your tools for delivering the environment. You want a good collection of deer, you want some bison to smash some down, you want some boar and some horses. They all eat slightly different things at slightly different times. They all do slightly different things to the vegetation. If you can replicate all of that, you would have a sort of functional set of landscape disturbers that would reintroduce what the grazing dynamics were at the end of the last ice age. And this one is extinct, if you like. So this is one that we need to bring back. We've got versions of many of the others. We've got wild boar, we have versions of the tarpan, but this is the one that's missing, if you like. All we have is a great deal of archaeological specimens. Okay, so this is one from Denmark. They were big. They were about as high as the ceiling here. They were much bigger than domestic cattle. They were quite effective at knocking things over and making holes in the ground, if you like. So, they were much bigger than domestic cattle. Okay, so that, if you like, is the context. In order to understand the contemporary situation, we had to do something of a digression back to a previous chapter of Enthusiasms for Aurochs, which is to go back to two brothers, Lutz and Heinz Heck, and their father, Ludwig Heck here, who were the directors of Munich and Berlin zoos in the 1920s and the 1930s. Okay, so the Hecks are a kind of zoological dynasty, and they ran these zoos in Germany in the 20s and the 30s, and both of them independently were very interested in trying to bring back the aurochs. Okay, so back in the 1920s and the 1930s, there was a sense that by virtue of having access to these breeding networks across Europe, they'd be able to get together cattle and to reassemble the aurochs. So both of them created herds of their cattle. These are Lutz's ones in Berlin Zoo, which they did in just a couple of years, and they looked, much like contemporary cattle. But there was a great celebration that these were, the aurochs had been reborn. And part of the logic for this was that they were working with close patronage from the National Socialist elite in Germany during this period. So particularly Hermann Göring, who was a senior figure in the Nazi Party, who was a very keen hunter. So Göring had this vision in which he would sponsor the Heck brothers to backbreed the animals in order to reintroduce them into the forests of Eastern Europe after they had been annexed through the Nazi invasion into Eastern Europe. So he gave the Heck brothers a lot of money. They created these animals and they introduced them into Bialoesia forest, which is this forest that still survives on the border between Poland and Belarusia. And Göring and Lutz Heck dressed up in traditional medieval garb and went on hunts to try and hunt these animals in the forest. And their thinking was caught up in what historians have described as a particular period of reactionary modernism. So there was this deep ambivalence in the Nazi Party about forms of contemporary life, and a sense that better relationships with nature would be found out there pursuing violent, very gendered activities, hunting animals in the forest. So they were both members of the Annerber, which was this very shadowy cultural organisation that was started to try and research, if you like, the mythological origins of the Aryan race. Their thinking was shaped by the story of the Nibelungenlied, which came to influence Wagner, and Fritz Lang, and that kind of cultural zeitgeist in Germany at the time, which looked back to a kind of medieval imaginary in which man and beast were in some violent struggle to justify a particular idea of rewilding. But they also managed to promote their animals as tools for what we now understand to be ecological restoration. Okay, so part of the racialized discourse about the Nazis moving into Eastern Europe was a notion that Slavic people didn't know how to manage the land. You had this process of desertification, and they kind of proposed the cattle as tools for the job that would go in and do what we now consider to be ecological restoration in these sites. Okay, so there's an earlier, very dark manifestation of rewilding that was dressed up in this kind of return to a mythologized Aryan kind of past that comes to shape the creation of these cattle during this period. The Allies bombed Berlin Zoo and Lutz's cattle were killed, but some of Heinz's cattle in Munich survived the war, and they were sort of left in the zoo and in these local nature reserves, and it was all very embarrassing and no one knew what to do with them, and they were kind of hidden away, and both of the brothers were quite successfully denazified and became quite popular figures in natural history in Germany. But it was much later, in the 1980s, as rewilding was taking off, that Frans Vera here, who's a Dutch paleoecologist who was responsible for managing this nature reserve in the Netherlands, was looking for hardy cattle to bring back to run his rewilding experiment. And so Vera heard about these het cattle. This was 1980, so Cold War. He managed to get some shipped over the Iron Curtain and introduced to the Netherlands and put into this site called the Oostvaardersplassen, which is a polder landscape. Let me show you where it is, just north of Amsterdam. Okay, so here we are in the Netherlands on the Flevoland, which is the largest artificial island in the world. Okay, so this is all land that was reclaimed from the sea in the 1950s. I'm just going to zoom in on it here. So this is mostly agricultural land and suburbs, but there was a bit of it just here which was never properly drained and never properly reclaimed. There's going to be an oil refinery there, but in the oil crisis in the 1970s it was shelved, and it became a nature reserve. And it became a nature reserve initially for birds, but Frans Vera heard about this site, and he wanted to see what would happen if he stuck a load of large herbivores in there to run it as a sort of simulation of what Europe would have been like at the end of the last ice age. Okay, so he had these herds of cattle, he had herds of horses, he had deer, and he lets them drive this ecosystem in a way that's supposed to simulate what happened at Europe at the end of the last ice age. He hasn't got any wolves, unfortunately, which makes it much more fraught to try and come up with a sort of naturalistic story. We're supposed to believe this is the Serengeti behind the dikes. This is a sort of wonderful, spontaneous experiment that came into existence. But there's you might have picked up on the politics that's been in the news a bit last year as to whether or not these animals should be left to die, which is what tends to happen, or whether they should be fed as an experiment. So this is, if you like, a kind of rewilding experiment gone wrong, but it began to float in conservationists' mind the idea that you could somehow get back to the aurochs, or you could have some version of the aurochs that you could recreate for the future. The Nazi history of these animals came to be widely known, and as a consequence, a lot of conservationists started to move away from them. Not so much in the UK, where we love all things Nazi, and so Derek Gow introduces these to the UK. The Sun has a field day, and he wanted to become, if you like, the kind of importer of choice for these particular cattle. It turns out they're very hard to handle. They're very dangerous. He gave some to Edinburgh Zoo. They escaped. They caused all sorts of damage. And as far as I know, there's not any left in the UK now. They're much better in these sort of big grazing estates. Instead, we have a Dutch project called the Tauros Programme, which is trying to use contemporary black breeding practices to try and get back to what they call, or try and create what they call the aurochs 2.0. Okay? So what they've done is they've sequenced the genome of the aurochs, which you can get from archaeological specimens, and they've got a lot of data on contemporary cattle breeds, and they've got a lot of data on what they look like, and so they're trying to mix and match a kind of aesthetics of this is what we think the aurochs should look like with the genetic data they have on what these breeds are, to try and within a few generations arrive at their aurochs 2.0. So if you like, there's a kind of recreation story. We're going to bring back the aurochs, in a similar way to what the Heck brothers were trying to do back at the start of the 20th century. They acknowledge that these animals need to be dog and child friendly, so they're already sort of selecting out animals that wouldn't go well into nature reserves. And they also kind of acknowledge that local people like local cows, and so they need to have particular breeds that kind of favour, you know, what the Italian version of this would be or what the Swedish version of this would be like. So there's a certain degree of, if you like, cosmopolitan specialisation going on in the way that the breeding happens, but still we're told that this is, if you like, the kind of cow that's being sort of brought back to drive rewilding. But in stark contrast, if you like, to the very dark kind of reactionary model that we saw with the National Socialists, this is taken back to a much more cosmopolitan kind of Greek identity. There's a sort of mythology of Europa, which is, you know, if you like, the sort of founding icon of Europe, in which this will be a cow for all people across Europe rather than the sort of xenophobic Nazi cow that will only work for certain cattle. But the story we get is the way in which mythology gets, you know, evoked to justify particular ideas of wildness, particular ideas of what a cow is, if you like, particular ideas of what wildness might be enabled in the present. I wasn't aware of the Mithra story, and I don't know how you'd fold Mithra into this, but I'm sure there's a version in which the Mithra model will come to the fore. And they imagine rewilding Europe, which is, if you like, the sister organisation of the Taros programme, have this sort of vision of Europe, which is to be inhabited by big beasts in all their splendour. They want to harness the large-scale land abandonment that's going on in many parts of Europe. You know, we've outsourced a lot of our farming to the tropics, so there's lots of land that's being freed up, and they see great opportunities for bringing back big beasts into various parts of the world. This always confuses me. I don't know what that is, or what ecological evidence you might have for bringing back some kind of marsupial into Scotland. But if you like, this is the kind of vision that's emerging in some circles as to what a wild Europe might look like. Okay, so just to round off, if you like, to summarise this story into a few points. So we get this sense that, you know, time is out of joint in these kind of macro stories about the Anthropocene. There is this real sense of anxiety and alarm about tipping points and planetary changes. There's a sense that we need to think very differently about time, both to grapple with the magnitude of these changes, but also to think creatively about how you could bring future imaginaries from the past to reorientate our dispositions to the environment. Rewilding is one of these models, which, you know, I think has some promise to think quite creatively about human-environment interactions. There are very dark historical precedents of that, you know, return to nature to justify particular futures. And there are various ways in which vernacular folk, indigenous knowledges, get kind of caught up to mobilise those projects. So I'll leave it there. Thank you. I don't know, how are we for time, Joel? Have we got time for discussion? Yeah, people have got into.
I was wondering if you know of any experiments where there has been like a human rewilding in these sort of landscapes with cows and horses.
When you say human rewilding, what do you mean?
I mean, like, because like humans working within the woods, like, I know that improves the lifespan of, like, say, a hazel tree, and humans' management of the woods is a rewilding just as much as all.
Yeah, I mean they are quite awkward about the place of people in these future landscapes. You know, there's a sense that this will be enabled by what they call decoupling. So we'll all go to the city and we'll concentrate agriculture industrially in particular places, and this will free up land for, if you like, for nature, and we'll then encounter it as tourists by and large. So there's that version of it. I guess where in a way where it gets interesting is there's a kind of neo-primitivist story about this, which is about, if you like, a kind of certain idea that the human body and the human immune system was calibrated by encounters with animals and encounters with soil and encounters with wildlife. So on the, if you like, on the microbiome scale, there's a story about microbiome rewilding, which is people thinking about their inner bodies in the same way as you might think about Yellowstone. People, you know, changing their diets, changing their dietary practices. The interface, you know, I mean, there's things like coppicing or things like, you know, traditional land use practices that are not that dissimilar to what humans are doing. Kind of falls through the cracks, if you like. There's still a kind of vague sense that it's best to keep people in a kind of observation capacity rather than actually doing lots of land management.
what is there any notion of what might produce this sort of change that's envisaged in terms of economics?
So I guess it depends where in the world you are. I mean, in the UK, they've managed to position rewilding as a kind of post-Brexit land management strategy for particular upland landscapes when it becomes trees, if you like. So the current enthusiasm for tree planting, there's a version of that which is driven by rewilding. You take the sheep off, you let the land grow, you reduce the herbivore densities. So that, if you like, if we change the subsidies from producing sheep to producing trees, then that model works. The Net project is a business. They run it as an ecotourism operation. They sell some meat. It's a very high-end kind of tourism business. What I guess has tended to happen is that we've redistributed where we grow food in the world, and so we can rewild temperate regions in the north because much of our food comes from the tropics. So globally, whether there's more wildness in the world or we've just redistributed it is
wouldn't that then reproduce the situation you mentioned at the beginning, the polarity between the green and the red?
in terms of the total. Yeah, so I think the big question is whether there's an aggregate increase in wildness in the world, or is it just we've redistributed the red and the green. So the green is now near us in rich northern places, and we've outsourced the intensive agriculture to other sites. I mean, it's too early to say in terms of how this is happening, but you'd want to see in just as many tropical rewilding projects as you would, marginal dairy farms in Sussex. But that's a definite risk, I think, that that the rewilders haven't really thought through.
Are plants ever considered like active kind of keystone species? Just because in this scenario, the animals are recognised as the kind of active agents in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, plants get quite a rough deal in this. I mean, they get smashed up and knocked around. I think some of what they want the species to do is to enable plants to do things that plants that need animals can't do. That's a very vague way of putting it. So lots of plants need their seeds to pass through animal bodies, let's say, and in the absence of animal bodies, the plants can't germinate. So the animals are kind of vectors to enable plants to grow. I think there's a broad sense that in the right density, these animals will create more diverse plant habitats. So if you get the Net example, which was a industrial farm, they've allowed the hedgerows to grow back in. They've allowed the oak trees, if you like, to propagate out into the fields in that way. But it's the oak is, if you like, the beneficiary rather than the way that it's storied. The model is that the plants are at the top, the animals are at the top, and the plants are at the bottom, and there's a kind of hierarchy that's set up in that fashion. Yeah. Two at the back.
Yeah, so a lot of the examples given kind of cover quite expansive, wide regions where rewilding is able to happen. But how does the concept fit into more urban environments where you've got lots of habitat fragmentation, lots of other pressures where you can't necessarily expand on some of the ideas or introduce keystone species without other consequences? So in your sort of view, how do those sort of principles apply to those environments, particularly with increasing urban pressures, and are they seen as separate, or how can they kind of amalgamate to draw some of the best elements out?
Yeah, I think it's a really important theme. I mean, there has been, I guess, a kind of anti-urbanism to some of the rewilding movement, that it needs to happen out there, and the city is, if you like, the place that people ought to be, and as a consequence, you kind of sacrifice the city for people. But there is a strong urban conservation, urban ecology movement that's picked up on some of this thinking. I guess particularly around celebrating sites that would otherwise have been seen as lost. So the whole brownfield conservation movement, for example, that was often driven by people curious about insects and plants rather than keystone species. And a lot of that is about less management. So a lot of, if you like, parks management is about keeping everything as simple as possible, so you can cut it with a very simple grass cutting system. You have a set of mature trees, and there's a certain kind of greenwashing that takes place in some forms of urban ecology. I think there's a sense in which we might be encouraged to be a bit lazier in our gardens and to maintain dead wood, not cut the grass so often, not spray so much. There is a model of urban gardening that I think is coming through, which, I mean, rewilding is a very generous term, so it could be described as rewilding, but
and maybe some more uniform sort of views across the board in terms of environmental conservation? Because obviously you've got so many different charities, organisations. One do the same thing, but obviously their own different approaches to get there.
Yeah.
So maybe
I mean, I think a lot of the history of conservation was groups championing particular species or particular sites, and the interests of one species is not always aligned with the interests of another species, and so you get these sort of conflicts. You know, the bird lobby, who are very powerful in the UK, can drive policies that are not particularly good for some other species in that way. I think, I mean, in Europe we've seen this quite striking return of keystone species into urban areas in Europe. So there are wolves in Belgium, there are wolves in the Netherlands. So far, they've not eaten anybody. I suspect they're eating people's pets, and that, you know, what that's doing to a kind of ecology of late night fear for cats, I'm not sure. But you know, there's a very interesting sort of, you know, in terms of, you know, predation by those sort of animals. So they're not going to get to the UK unless they're helped. But there are some kind of compelling stories about how you can have forms of coexistence with wolves, and wild boar is another one that have, you know, really returned in sizable numbers and causing lots of problems in Berlin and Barcelona and places like that. But,
I was wondering if you could say a few words on how you see the future of conservation, because, for example, rewilding is quite, in this particular case, was probably not very successful because it was in a very enclosed area, whereas in my opinion this kind of failed because animals need more space. But at the same time, things like national parks are quite problematic, especially in the global south, where population of indigenous people have been evicted to create this sort of like biodiversity enclosure. So how do you see it evolving?
yeah, I mean, I think there is a very stark geography to how it's evolving in different parts of the world. I'm not sure if there is a single model or a single trajectory, or that there ought to be. So certainly in temperate regions, there is a general, you know, declining pressure on agriculture, albeit there's a lot of pressure through renewable energy and through housing and all the rest, but a sort of a tolerance of the presence of animals that might not have been there previously. At the same time, you know, general consumption of stuff continues to increase, both, you know, in terms of land, in terms of food, and that puts pressure on land and puts pressure on wildlife. And so, you know, the headline story is still of, you know, lots of losses, lots of fragmentation. The degree to which the interests of conservation can be reconciled with the interests of tackling climate change is another big question. You know, I mean, one of the, you know, proposals for addressing climate change is to plant a load of trees to draw down the carbon, and the, you know, the types of trees that you might plant are not necessarily the types of trees that are very good for wildlife. You know, so we might see lots of plantations going up. You know, the politicians who want to promote tree planting, and, you know, technically there'll be lots of trees and there'll be lots of carbon, but, you know, I don't know if you've been to any of the plantations in the UK, but they're pretty dead sites. You know, there's not a lot that lives there. They look like trees, and everyone loves trees, but so there is a potential trade-off that we might have where, you know, what's seen as a good environmental thing, you know, planting trees, actually ends up having knock-on consequences. But I'm not sure I've got a single vision as to where it's going. I think it touches down in different places.
Yeah, when do we acknowledge we reach a tipping point? I mean, do we need to witness a radical sudden change, or?
Tipping point in the Earth system, if you like,
Yeah.
rather than a kind of political tipping point. I mean, that's the question that the scientists grapple with. You know, is that how would you know it when you're in it, or do you only know it after it's happened? I guess there is, you know, there's a lot of trends that get detected, but what sort of magnitude of a tipping point might look like is, I think, to a certain extent in the eye of the beholder. You know, the fires in Australia, you know, for the Australian system, that looked like a pretty profound tipping point in terms of what fire dynamics look like. You know, extreme weather events in North America, but what, you know, within our lifetimes, it's unlikely that we'll wake up one morning and it will be, we're now in a kind of state. It's a kind of longitudinal lapse that happens. I'm sure a scientist would say we've got ways of quantifying that. We can tell you, but I'm not sure if it's as much about how the public sense it.
Does it mean it's irreversible?
Some of them are. I mean, or at least some of the ways in which systems might unravel, the degree of energy required to revert them back are. I mean, I guess if we're thinking about atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, you know, once they're up there, it takes a long time for them to come down again. You know, methane decays quite slowly. You know, all the carbon we put up there now is up there for a very, very long time. To take that back down again requires, you know, pretty heavy engineering to bring it back into the soil. So yes, I guess there's a lot of change locked in already, just by virtue of what we put up there.
Have you examined kind of, I guess, the stakeholders' perspective on these projects? I mean, I'm sure these cost a lot of money. These aren't apolitical projects either. What is your opinion on the kind of discourse that these rewilding projects create?
There is a lot of political tension around some of these projects. I mean, it depends where in the world we're looking. One of the striking things about rewilding is it's been propelled by a kind of model of philanthrocapitalism. There's a lot of very wealthy, often second-generation industrialists who've put a load of money into this. So in Scotland, for example, the heir to the MFI furniture empire owns a big estate. The guy who owns ASOS is a big rewilding enthusiast. In South America, it was the people behind North Face and Patagonia. So there's a sense, as there is in many other parts of the kind of, same in the arts world, that there are a small number of people who have huge leverage, and often they have the power to drop in on these sites and do things, without local consultation. Some of these places, I guess the issue is a longitudinal decline in rural living. So lots of young people have left the land. You've got villages with old people in them. So there's a sense that anything that happens there could be a positive if it brings people back, until the wolves start eating the sheep in that way. At least in bits of Europe. So it cuts in different ways, but as in conservation in other parts of the world, there's often been a certain degree of outsider muscling in, telling people what to do, with limited consultation or compensation.
Excuse me, with Europe, is it only envisaged as a rewilding tool, to say, or can it also be considered food for humans?
I think you could eat them. I think at the moment they're too valuable to be turned into meat, but I mean they come from farming animals, so there's no reason why one couldn't farm them. I mean at NEP, which is the British.
But you'd farm them, you wouldn't.
Well, I guess we're farming and wilding and hunt. I mean, I think the hunting. We're very ambivalent, at least in the UK, about hunting. I mean, one of the thought experiments, if you like, is if we're happy to de-domesticate cattle, could we de-domesticate dogs to be wolf surrogates, but keep some of the elements of dogs that would make them compliant and not do those things? Which, on one hand is a straightforward like-for-like comparison, but if you think of all the machinations in the UK about hunting with dogs, and how much political capital went into banning hunting with dogs from conservation organisations around fox hunting, some of these organisations are now going, well, maybe it should be quite helpful to be able to hunt other things with dogs, deer, but how could we square that off with our membership? So this, hunting cattle, at least in the UK, in parts of Australia, in the outback in Australia, there are feral herds of cattle which are akin to aurochs, if you like, that big game hunters will go and shoot, and on Hawaii as well, for some reason. So that opportunity exists if you want to take it up. The internet is your friend. You can find
Not at all. No, just
feral cattle hunting.
Resource
yeah.
idea.
I mean, at NEP they sell premium beef, if you like. So this is wild beef. They do corporate hospitality, so you have it served. And in order to do so, the animals are subject to the normal veterinary regulations, but they don't deworm them, which has had all sorts of amazing effects on the soil, because if you imagine all this cow shit, which in the British countryside is toxic, really. They've got this cow shit which has all these dung beetles in it, so it's got amazing density of dung beetles. So just lifting some quite small agricultural medical regimes has created this great soil biodiversity, but they are still able to sell that because they have them tagged and vaccinated in some ways. Yeah, so it's somewhere on a continuum, I guess, between the wild and anyone else. I realise it's very warm in this room. Yeah.
You mentioned briefly about ideas of rewilding by microbiology. I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, so I guess people familiar with the story of the microbiome, that at the end of the Human Genome Project, it turned out that a lot less of us was determined by our core genome and much more of us was determined by the other bits of life in us. So they turned the sequencing tools to sequence all the bacteria and the fungi that live on and around us. and then have begun a set of, if you like, studies to look at how the rise of particular autoimmune allergic diseases might be correlated to the absence of particular microbes in the body. And there's quite compelling, if you like, broad brush epidemiological evidence that suggests that, you know, missing particular microbes might account for the rise in various autoimmune allergic diseases. In terms of successful experiments to restore microbes that solve those problems, has been much less convincing than I think the scientists hoped. The breakthrough intervention was the fecal microbiota transplant. You can probably work out what I mean by that if you think it through. For people who have long-term antibiotic-resistant infections in the lower intestine, you can give people an enema, basically, of healthy poo. It shifts the, if you like, the dysbiotic community, and that's been, you know, subject to clinical trials. The FDA regulated in its favour, and as a consequence, they can now experiment using that for other gut conditions. The people who I've looked at most are people taking parasitic worms, hookworm, which is an organism that we co-evolved with and that many people in the world still have. And the theory is that the hookworm is a keystone species for the gut microbiome in a way that the wolf is the keystone species for Yellowstone. And so in the absence of worms, the gut microbiome goes into dysbiosis and creates these autoimmune conditions. So there are people taking hookworm, lots of them, 20,000 or so of them, and sharing them online in various communities, and you know, in that space there's very compelling stories that people have, particularly have Crohn's or IBD or conditions like that, have had quite transformative effects. When it comes to trials, it's never very convincing. So again, the regulation around that is very strict. So yeah, it's definitely a live thing, and there's a borrowing of kind of ecological ideas from, if you like, the countryside to make sense of what's going on within our bodies. Shall we leave it there? Thank you
again.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.